distinguished collector and presidential advisor, Set Momjian. The son of Armenian immigrants, Momjian's life reflects the essence of the American dream. He worked as an executive for the Philco Company and then the Ford Philco. Upon retiring, he served as U.S. Representative to the United Nations under Jimmy Carter, working with Andrew Young and Coretta Scott King. His personal friendship with Mrs. Johnson and with the Carters led to becoming an official advisor to every president since, especially when it comes to his passion for collecting presidential china. Nicholas Basbane studied collectors of all stripes and interests and wrote a book about them. The one trait that is common to all collectors is what he calls a gentle madness, the unquenchable passion to acquire and to know everything about something, be it baseball cards, antique furniture, art, or in this instance, presidential china. When the curatorial staff at the Hoover pondered what kind of exhibit would best reflect our golden anniversary, they went back to our mission to collect, preserve, and interpret the life and times of Herbert Hoover. While presidential libraries archive the personal and public papers of a president, the museum documents more than the life. It documents the evolution of the presidency. One of the most visible activities of a president deals with social functions, especially White House state dinners. And because of the Great Depression, the Hoovers did not order any presidential china. Rather, they used the pattern purchased by Woodrow Wilson. In seeking how to compare this pattern with other administrations, the same collector's name kept being mentioned, Set Momjian. Marcus Eckhart obtained Mr. Momjian's telephone number from a colleague who had recently borrowed materials from him. Many collectors are wary of loaning their materials, fearing that things might be damaged, or worse, lost in transit. Other collectors are secretive, not wishing to disclose what they own. But Mr. Momjian was very friendly, and after hearing why we were making the request, quickly agreed to loan a representative sample of presidential china. We're extremely grateful to Set and Joan Momjian for allowing us to display a small part of their much larger and vast collection of presidential china. But displaying these wonderful pieces is only part of a larger and more interesting story. Every item has its own unique history. A true collector will not only know the importance of the item they're collecting, but also the provenance of each piece, how it got from a president to eventually into their hands. So it's crucial to secure the collector himself, to provide a glimpse into why he collects and how he built a world-class collection. In the course of his talk, you'll get an idea of some of the unusual lengths collectors exert to secure items that will enhance their collections. You will also get a rare insight into an extraordinary man and a gentleman. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Set Momjian.
Before I give my talk, I want to commend everybody that works at the Hoover Library. I've never been so impressed in my life. I've been collecting presidential china material information on presidents. I learned more on Hoover in one day here than I did in 50 years. I give speeches all over the country, and hereafter, Hoover will be included in every one of my speeches. My wife and I collect many things. 19th century American paintings, rare books, models of city sculpture. We have the model of William Penn on top of Philadelphia City Hall. We have the model of by Bartoli of the Statue of Liberty. We have the only known model of freedom on top of the Capitol in Washington. We have the only known model of the Washington Monument when it had a building underneath, supposed to have a building. They didn't have the money for the building, so they just did the obelisk. We have the model of Jackson on the horse. It's in Lafayette Park across from the White House. And we have the only known model of Thomas Jefferson in the Jefferson Memorial. We collect letters of Robert Browning declining invitations from women. When Elizabeth Barrett Browning died, every woman in London was after Robert Browning. But we're best known for our collection of china, of British royalty, French emperors, Russian czars, and of course the White House. The White House china is the only item that truly reflects the taste of the first family. When a president leaves office, everything leaves with him. Only one thing remains: the White House china, if he was lucky enough to order it. Most first ladies wait to the end of their administration to order china because many of the first ladies have been criticized when they ordered their china. Mary Todd Lincoln ordered china with a purple border. The people in the press complained that she thought she was royalty using purple. Lucy Hayes ordered china with fish, birds, and animals. The public and press said, "Who wants to see the animal you just ate in its original habitat?" Eleanor Roosevelt ordered china with the Roosevelt coat of arms before they came into this country. A rose and 3 feathers. The public and press complained that she had used a foreign coat of arms on the china of the American president. Lady Bird Johnson ordered china with flowers. The public and press thought it wasn't presidential enough. And Nancy Reagan spent a fortune on her china, they complained. Truman had no problem. He took the Lenox salesman into the state dining room, looked around, and said, "Make the china the same color as the walls." They didn't complain for him. There's no china for Kennedy. There's no china for Nixon. There's no china for Ford. There's no china for Carter. There's no china for Hoover. Nobody knew what the Kennedy china was going to look like. I ran ads all over the country for presidential china. A fellow called me from Florida and says, "I have a letter of Jacqueline Kennedy's. I'm going to charge you 10 times what it's worth and you're going to buy it." I said, "Read it to me." It's a letter from her to a fellow in Wilmington giving a complete description of what she wanted her china to be. A yellow, almost melon color, not too many patriotic symbols, unlike any other presidential china. Has to be a memory of our time at the White House. I bought the china. I bought the letter. 5 years later, I'm at the Atlantic City Antique Show, and I'm walking down an aisle, and I look to my right, and I see a yellow, almost melon-colored plate with a small presidential seal. I dash in, I pick up the plate, and I ask the woman, "How much do you want for it?" She said, "My husband will be back in a couple of minutes." The husband comes back, and I said, "How much do you want for the plate?" He said, "You read the note." I said, "What note?" He said, "There's a note with the plate." So I went to where I picked up the plate, and there's a note from Lillian Parks, an African-American maid in the White House for 35 years. And in the note, she said, "The President and Mrs. Kennedy took turns eating off this plate for 1 week to see if they would like it. This was going to be their china in the next administration." So I have the only Kennedy plate known. We use our china. One day I got a call from Carter, secretary. She said, "Carter is coming to Philadelphia. He'd like to RON over your house." I said, "He can do whatever he wants over my house." I hung up and I went into the kitchen and I said to my wife, "You're not going to believe it, Carter's coming to Philadelphia. He's going to RON over our house." My wife said, "What's RON?" I said, I don't know. She said, call the secretary, find out. So I called Carter's secretary and I said, what's RON? She said, remain overnight. I ran into my wife and said, I was going to stay here overnight. So we decided to do a big dinner and invite all our friends and serve the dinner on different plates. Somebody will eat for Washington's plate, somebody's going to eat off of Lincoln's plate. The week before he was coming, the Secret Service came to check our house. We have a 9-bedroom, 9-bathroom house. They didn't like the electrical wiring. They changed the electrical wiring at their cost. When they were leaving, I said, any chance of them coming back next year? We may need a new roof. Anyhow, Carter came to my home. We had a dinner that night, and as I said, everybody ate off at different presidents' plates. He went to bed at 10 o'clock. He said, is it okay if I go to bed early? I said, yes. He went up at 10 o'clock. My children were making, I had 2 sons, they were young sons, they were making a lot of noise. I said, quiet, the president's asleep upstairs. The next morning, Carter woke up and went jogging with my children in the neighborhood. I got a call from FDR Jr. one day. He said, we're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of my mother's birth all over the country. We'd like to celebrate it also in Philadelphia at your home. And I said, fine. And my wife and I decided that we would recreate the dinner that the president and his wife gave to the Queen of England in 1939. So I called Roosevelt and I said, I'd like to go over the menu of that dinner. So we went, met with him. He gave us everything that they had. And he said, oh, by the way, he said, Henry Morgenthau was Secretary of the Treasury. He bought strawberries from his farm in Fishkill, New York, for Eleanor to make the strawberry shortcake. For our party, Henry Morgenthau's son bought strawberries from the same farm for my wife to make strawberry shortcake. And the Roosevelt family came. We had a big dinner party. We had Rich Little, the great imitator of our house, one night for dinner. I served each course on a different presidential plate. And he talked in the voice of the president and played of him in front of him as we served each plate. I got a call one day from a movie producer. He said, we're producing a movie called The American President. And we'd like to use your White House China to recreate the China room. I said, fine. He said, how much do you want? I said, I've never charged anybody in my life for anything. I said, but you're a profit-making establishment, and I gave him a figure. He said, we don't have that in the budget. I said, I'll make a deal with you. Have my wife play a love scene in the movie with Robert Redford. We'll call it even. He said no and hung up. He called me back the next morning. He said, you got a deal. I said, the money or my wife? He said, the money. Robert Redford was my wife's favorite president. But they changed it when the movie came out. Michael Douglas played the president. Lady Bird Johnson was turning 75, and Congress wanted to have a birthday party for her in the Capitol. They knew for 20 years she was trying to get one piece of her White House china. She didn't have a single piece. And she had no luck. And they said, would you give her a place setting of the Johnson china? I said, yes. They said, we'll invite you to the party. So on the given day, my wife and I went to the Capitol. We went into the room where they're going to have the party. And the chairman came over to me and he said, Set, you can't give her the china today. I said, why not? He said, all the congressmen are going to be giving her presents, and yours is going to overtake hers. So why don't you give it to her tomorrow at the hotel at the Watergate? I said, okay. So we had dinner that night. And the next day, my wife, myself, and I had my one son come with a camera. So we go to the Watergate Hotel, and I put all the boxes on a table in front of the sofa, and we had breakfast there. And then Lady Bird came and sat on the sofa. My wife sat on her left, I sat on her right. And as she opened each box, she jumped in the air holding the plate up, and my son took a photograph. I have all these photographs of Lady Bird Johnson jumping into the air with photographs. Every president has favorite stories. My best story is Carter's best story that he tells about his mother, Miss Lillian. President Carter became president, but he wasn't in the White House yet. And a reporter called Miss Lillian from New York and said, I'd like to interview you about your son. She said, fine. She said, tell me when you're coming, and I'll pick you up at the airport. On the given day, she goes to the airport. The reporter gets off the plane. She said, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so glad you came. They get in her car and they go to her home, and the reporter interviews her for an hour. After the hour, the reporter says to Miss Lillian, Miss Lillian, I want to level with you. I really didn't come for the interview. You have constantly said your son has never told a lie. And I wanted to be face to face with you and ask you, has your son ever told a lie? She said, no, he's never told a lie. He said, I can't believe it. You're telling me he's never, ever told a lie? She said, maybe a white lie once in a while. He says, what's the difference between a white lie and a regular lie? She said, you remember when I met you at the airport and I said I was so happy to see you? I'm so glad you came. She said, that was a white lie. I was having dinner with Mrs. Carter up in the private quarters one day, and she knew everything I collected. She said, what else do you collect? I said, I collect bank checks of the presidents. Oh, she said, you don't have one of Jimmy's. She said, I do all the checks. 3 days later, I'm in the White House. And the social secretary says, I want to see you. I stop in and see her. She hands me a check, signed by Carter, made out for $1. That's in my collection now. On the 200th anniversary, for the bicentennial year, Bill Clinton had a luncheon in the White House, and he invited all the presidents, Ford, Carter, Bush, Clinton, they were all there. My wife and I were invited. And each of the presidents got up and told about their time at the White House. Ford got up. And he said, when I was president, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came to Washington. They came to the White House. And we're in the elevator going up to the private quarters. When the elevator door opens, my son is standing there naked. So I look at my son, I look at the Queen, and the Queen says, "Don't worry, we have one just like him at home." The next day, Ford said, I had a dinner in her honor. And the Marine Band is playing. And I decided to go up to her. And I said, let's dance. So we walked to the dance floor. And as her foot hit the dance floor, the band started playing The Lady is a Tramp. It wasn't intentional. They insured for it. It just happened that the Queen was walking on there when it came out. I was ambassador to the United Nations with Andy Young. And I have the largest African American collection. And Coretta Scott King was there. And I used to have breakfast with her, lunch with her, and dinner with her. One day she invited me to her apartment for lunch. And she had a photographer there to take 23 photographs of her and me. The next week, she sent me a letter. The last line, "Thanks for keeping the dream alive." And for an African-American collector, you can't get anything better than that. Now, years later, Madeleine Albright was the ambassador to the United Nations. And she decided to invite all the previous ambassadors to New York for lunch. We all went, and she asked each of us to get up and tell our favorite story. So we each got up and we told a story. Then she was going to tell a story. She said there was an obnoxious reporter, a woman, who I did not like. And she was always calling me for interviews, and I was always putting her off. And if I was walking down the hall and she was coming in my direction, I'd duck into a room. She said, one day I'm at the UN and I have to go to the ladies' room. She said, I go to the ladies' room and I open the stall and the woman's reporter is sitting on the toilet. So she said, I close the door and I'm standing there. The woman gets up, comes out, and says, Madam Ambassador, now that we know each other so well, how about giving me that interview? Senator Biden's sister, Senator Biden was a good friend of mine. For years, we had breakfast on the train. He'd get on in Philadelphia. I'd get on in Philadelphia. He'd get on in Wilmington. And we talked all the way to Washington. One day he said to me, my sister is coming to Washington with a priest and a nun. Can you take him to lunch at the White House? I said, when is she coming? She said, tomorrow. I said, I eat in the president's dining room. There's only 5 tables. I got to give him a week's notice. He said, see what you can do. So the next day I go to the dining room. I get a hold of the chef. And I said, I need a table for 4 tomorrow. He said, I can't give it to you. He said, there's a waiting list a mile long. And he said, if I put you in that dining room, I'm going to be in trouble. I said, put it another table. He said, I can't help you. I said, it's not important unless you're Catholic. He said, I'm Catholic. Why? I'm bringing a priest and a nun. He said, you want the 10 o'clock or the 1:15 sitting? I was lacking a plate from the Truman administration. Truman had left the presidency, and I sent him a letter telling him I'd trade one President Grant plate for one Truman plate. He sent me a letter back thanking me for my letter and saying one Democratic plate is worth two Republican plates, notwithstanding the fact that Grant was a great general. One day I'm reading the New York Times, and on the front page there's an article about 200 letters of Jacqueline Kennedy's grandfather going at auction. They're letters to his mistress, and they're all off color. I said to my wife, I think I want those. She said, Seth, you're never going to get them. Jacqueline Kennedy's going to get them. I said, I'm going to try. There was a woman in New York called Mary Benjamin who was a socialite, but she dealt in autographs. And if she was going to get them, Jacqueline was going to get them, that's who she would go to bid for her. So I called Mary Benjamin. I said, are you bidding on those letters of Jacqueline Kennedy's grandfather? She said, no. I said, will you bid for me? She said, yes. She walks into the auction, I understand. Everybody turns around and says, there's no use bidding on him. She's bidding for Jacqueline Kennedy. There was very little bidding. Mary Benjamin got the letters. The press ran over to her and said, who'd you buy those letters for? She said, I can't reveal my source. She said, we know who you bought them for. I have the letters. And a lot of it is poetry. One poem is to a lady in quest of new clothes. The gentle Eve before the fall in clothing was inclined to stall. When she once became a hussy, then it was she turned quite fussy. Methinks leaf gear a doubtful shield to dull the gaze on things concealed. And Eve's native poise was simple till she strove to hide each dimple. Mark then what happened in a trice, both shorter skirts and longer price. The good old days have gone a glee for costly garb and hosiery. 'Tis thus economy is shocked, when simple taste becomes unfrocked. Bring back the style before the fall. The best dressing is none at all. That was her grandfather. I have all the letters. Carter, I knew Carter before he went into the White House. And when he went into the White House, he called me. And he said, I'm having a lunch for my family and my best friends, and I want you to be there. So I told my wife. And the day before the luncheon, my wife went to bed about 10 o'clock. I stayed up to 12 getting my clothes ready, my shoes shined. And I was going to leave so early in the morning, if the train broke down in Baltimore, I was going to walk to Washington to make that lunch. So it's midnight. My wife is going to bed at 10 o'clock. I figure she's sound asleep. I'm getting into bed, and my wife says something to me. And I said, Joan, I thought you were asleep. She said, no. She said, I'm lying here thinking. And with all the humility I could muster up, I figured she must be thinking her husband's going to be meeting with Carter today. I said, dear, what are you thinking? She says, Seth, you're going to go out very early in the morning. Don't forget to put out the trash. She's sitting here someplace. I used to travel a lot on the train and on the planes back and forth all over the place. And I always I was in Secret Service, but I had Secret Service briefcase, everything Secret Service. And I traveled with the Secret Service briefcase. And one day I'm going to fly someplace. I have a Secret Service briefcase, and I go to pick up my tickets. And the woman says, "Are you armed?" I said, "No." I get on the plane, and I have a window seat. And on my left is a woman sitting there. And she keeps looking down at my briefcase and looking at me. She looks at my briefcase and she's looking at me. Another woman gets on the train, comes to our aisle, and points to me and says, "You're in my seat." I looked at the ticket, I said, "No, this is my seat." She gets a stewardess. The stewardess comes and says, "Can I see your boarding pass?" I hand it to her. She says, "Your name Mary Anderson?" I said, "No." She said, "This is Mary Anderson's boarding pass." The woman that is looking at my briefcase says, "I know you're secret, but that's ridiculous using a woman's name." I got a letter one day from Carter. I was getting lots of letters from him. And I got a letter. And I didn't have a good look on my face. And my wife says, "What's wrong? What's in the letter?" I said, "He signed it Jimmy." "Oh," she said. I said, "I'm a collector. Jimmy Carter is better than Jimmy." So a couple of days later, Carter said, "Did you get my letter?" I said, "Yeah," but I said, "Let's not get too formal." I said, "You signed it Jimmy. You know I'm a collector." We laughed. When I got older, I realized it's better to have a letter Jimmy. Carter. I have a letter of Jacqueline Kennedy's that she wrote to the chef. "Don't waste good wine on teetotalers. Use the cheap stuff." There was an auction house I used to go to in Philadelphia called Wessler's. And I went in one day. I couldn't find anything I wanted. And it bothered me. I looked into a cabinet and there's some military buttons. I said, "Can I see the military buttons?" I looked at the military buttons. And I wanted to see the back, so I pulled them up. And there was a piece of paper behind. And it says, "For John Kennedy, his grandfather's military buttons." And it was signed by Jacqueline's mother. So I put it back and I closed it. Next to it were 2 wedding rings. Can I see the wedding rings? I looked inside. To Janet from Jack. The other one to Janet from Hugh. Her mother's 2 husbands. And a lot of jewelry. No mention of Kennedy whatsoever. The auction was on Tuesday, the next day. So I go to the auction house the next day. They come up for auction. No mention of Kennedy. I bought him for nothing. Pins, jewelry, everything. So that's it on that. I talked to you about the Statue of Liberty. There was a model that I wanted. nobody knew where it was. And one day I was driving my wife to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and there was a lot of traffic. So coming home, I came home by way of a small town called Manayunk, and I'm driving, and I look to my right, and I see a Statue of Liberty in the window. I pull over the car, look at it. It's the missing Statue of Liberty. I go around to the front door. It's locked. It says only open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I copy down the emergency number, go home, call the guy. I said, I'm calling you about the Statue of Liberty. He said, it's not for sale. I said, we haven't talked. He said, it's not for sale. There was a friend of mine by the name of Mort Packman that used to be able to do anything. I called him and I said, there's a Statue of Liberty in Manayunk. I want you to get it for me. He said, how much do you want to pay? I said, I don't care what it costs. He said, get $100 bills in the total amount you want to pay, and I'll be over. I got the $100 bills, gave them to Mort Packman. I said, my wife and I are going to the mountains this weekend. We'll be home on Sunday. If you get it, put it in the center hall. So when I walk in, I'll see it. We went up to the mountains, came back, opened the door, and the Statue of Liberty was there. I called Mort and I said, how'd you do it? He said, I'll be by tomorrow. He came the next day. And he said, I went to the store, parked my car, and when I went in, the guy was sitting behind a table with his wife. I went in and I said, I'm here for the Statue of Liberty. He says, not for sale. So I reached into my coat pocket, took out the $100 bills, and I put them on the table one at a time, and I saw his wife's lips moving. As I dropped the last $100 bill, she swoops them up. I went into the window, got the Statue of Liberty, and said, thank you very much. Now, if she didn't pick up the $100 bills, I had the other half in this pocket. Now, the story doesn't stop there. Years later, his sister calls me, and she says that Mort's in Bryn Mawr Hospital. He's in a life support. They're going to take him off life support tomorrow. I said, I'll be there. So I immediately went to the hospital, and Mort's sister was there with Mort's girlfriend, and they were talking about funeral arrangements. And I felt funny, even though he's in a coma, talking about funeral arrangements. So I called her aside, both of them, and I told them the story about Mort getting the Statue of Liberty for me. When I talked about getting the $100 bills out of this pocket, we heard ha 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 from the bed. We rushed over to the bed. He was back in a coma. His sister rushed out, got the doctor. Doctor came, didn't believe us. He said, we'll leave him on life support for another couple of weeks. They left him on life support for a couple of weeks and then took him off. At his funeral, his sister called me and said, I'd like you to tell the story at the funeral. So I tell people, if you know somebody who's on life support, they may be able to hear you. I mean, we heard him laugh, but the doctor said it's impossible. The most famous story that I talk about is a woman by the name of Frances Green. I'm with friends of mine one day, and we're going to the White House. I'm waiting for them to get cleared. And in front of me is an elderly woman in a white dress, white hat, white pocketbook, white gloves, but all the clothing was white maybe 10 years ago or 20 years. It was yellow. And I said to my friends, this woman doesn't have an invitation. So as we moved along in line, I said to the woman, are you from Washington? She said, no, I'm from Daly City, California. I spent all of my money to come here. I came by train. It took me 2.5 days. I got the cheapest hotel room I could find. But this is the happiest day of my life that Reagan invited me to the White House. I said, you have an invitation with you. She takes it out. Envelope says Francis Green, Daly City, California. I take it out. It says, you're invited to the White House. But down in the left-hand corner, it says RSVP card enclosed. I said, you sent in your RSVP card. Oh, no, she said. I was taught invitations like this, you answer in writing. She said, I sent President Reagan a letter telling him I was coming. If she'd have looked at the RSVP card, it said encloses my check. It was a fundraiser. She gets to the Secret Service agent. He said, what's your name? She says, Francis Green. He said, you're not on the guest list. She's trying to take the invitation out, and he shoves her aside. I go in, I talk to the committee. They said, we can't do anything. She has no clearance. She never really had an invitation. We can't let her in. I get my friend settled, and I go out. She's still there looking through the fence. So I walk over to her. She said, this was to be the happiest day of my life. She said, it was saddest. They were rude to me. She said, they wouldn't look at my invitation. I said, what are you going to do now? She said, I don't know. I said, you're going to be here Monday? She said, yes. I'll give you a tour of the White House. She said, inside? I said, yes. So I put her in a cab, dropped her off at her hotel, and came back to the White House. Talked to the president's secretary, and I said, tell Reagan what happened to this woman. She said, okay. I called the Republican National Committee, and I said, how could you send a solicitation for money to a penniless woman? They said, what was her name? I said, Francis Green. They hid her name in a computer, and here for 8 years, she had sent $1 every year. And they decided to send this to all regular contributors, regardless of the amount. I called the president's secretary, and I said, put that in the letter too. She calls me back, and she said, you can bring her at 11 o'clock on Monday to meet with Reagan. I call Francis Green. I don't mention anything about her meeting with Reagan. I said, don't forget we have a date on Monday. She said, can I wear slacks? I said, no, I want you to wear the same white dress. You'll find out why in a minute. So on Monday, I pick her up. We drive to the White House. I give her a tour. When we finish the tour, there's a sofa outside the president's office. I tell her to sit down. She sits down. We're sitting there. The president is meeting with security because of the downed airliner. About 10 of 11, the door opens. They come out. President's secretary sees me and says, wait a minute, closes the door. She opens the door and motions for me to come in. Now, when you go into the Oval Office, the president can tell you how many teeth you have. He knows your mother's name, your father's name, your children's name. He knows everything about you. He knows this woman doesn't have 5 cents to her name. He knows this woman can be of no help to him. He knows this woman never had an invitation. By contrast, she doesn't know where she's going. I tell her to get up. We walk into the room. She realizes where she is. She starts to shake. She sees Reagan behind the desk. She starts to cry. Reagan gets up, comes over, puts his arm around her, and says, Francis, the darn computer's fouled up again. Sure you had an invitation. They should have called me from the gate. I cried. He said, I have a photographer here. I want to take your photograph. It's the best photograph of me ever taken. The two of them are holding hands. I'm standing between them like I'm saying, what God has put together, let no man put asunder. And the photograph will be up here for you. Thank you very much.